Hello and welcome back to 7 Minutes of Sport. Today I am very lucky to be in the presence of two very impressive guests who are going to be speaking about concussions in their respective sports. My first guest is Asia Hall, who is Head of Regulation at the British Horseracing Authority. Asia is a barrister who has previously been a senior lawyer at the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and she has been head of regulation at the BHA for almost 2 years. I'm very grateful that she has taken some time out of her insanely busy schedule to come and speak with us today. Asia, hello, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And I'm also very excited to say that my second guest is the first athlete to come on this podcast. He is a retired rugby union player, having played club rugby mainly for Bath and Worcestershire Warriors, as well as for Harlequins and Leicester Tigers. He also played back row and forward for England Sevens. If you haven't guessed by now, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Richard Di Carpentier onto the podcast. Richard, hello.
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, in case you are a listener who is joining us for the first time today, the way this podcast works is that I will interview Asia and Richard for a total time of 7 minutes, hence the name 7 Minutes of Sport. Now, I do have a timer with me to make sure that I stick to that 7 minutes. So the only thing left to do before I start the timer is to ask Asia and Richard, are you ready?
I am.
Ready?
Lovely. In which case, Asia, I'm going to start about asking you about concussions in racing. So the BHA has published quite comprehensive guidance when it comes to concussions, as it is the third most common injury for jockeys. Now, obviously, none of us are medical experts, but can you start by just briefly explaining what a concussion is?
So in the most simple form, a concussion is a brain injury. And for horse racing, it obviously happens when they have a fall from a horse, potentially not even banging their heads up seriously, but the impact of that fall creates an injury, which creates, particularly for horse racing, a huge risk for us that we need to be able to manage.
Now, this might be an obvious question, but why is it so important for regulators such as the BHA to give advice to participants in the sport who might have concussions?
So we've undertaken a huge amount of research. Dr. Jerry Hill, who is our Chief Medical Officer, has really developed this area quite significantly, particularly in the last couple of years, to ensure, as I say, the safety of both horse and rider. We have got people who are going full pelt round a track on top of a four-legged animal who sometimes you'd hope is in control, but not necessarily always in control. And the risk to both horse and rider and your fellow participants is enormous. So we've got to make sure that the people who are riding in these races are doing it safely, that when they get on the horse each time, that they have got all the skills and the cognitive function to be able to ride that horse safely, not only for themselves, but for others as well.
And just as an example, what sort of advice do the BHA give jockeys who might have a concussion?
So we're quite strict on it. They use this four-worded little test that needs to be applied in each circumstance. So firstly, it's recognising. So we try and train jockeys as much as we possibly can. And there's other charities that support us in doing this to recognise the symptoms and signs for concussion after they've had a fall. If there are signs of concussion, they then need to remove themselves. Now, for a mandatory period of time, if a jockey does have concussion, we say they should be stood down for 7 days, and that's the minimum. So after the 7 days, they will then be assessed by Dr. Jerry and others to ensure that if they are going to return to riding, that they are safe to do so. So we've got recognise, remove, recover, taking the time to do that, and then safely returning to riding thereafter.
So all the R's.
All the R's.
And moving on to another R, what resources are available to those in the industry who might want to learn more about concussions and how to prevent them?
So on the website, there is a particular section for concussion. We've got the graduated return to riding guidelines, which they can read. There is a direct line into Dr. Jerry, and all of our jockeys do have a great relationship with him to speak about their symptoms, to speak about recovery and what they need to be doing. We also have a learning module on the British Racing Race to Learn program that we have. So we've got the concussion awareness course, we've got a fact sheet, we've then got contact details for testing centres, for support networks. So we really do, we've put in quite a lot of resource into this, we put a lot of time into it, and just making it as accessible to all riders as possible. Because particularly with racing, you need to remember that we have our licensed jockeys, but we also have unlicensed people who are on yards riding out day in, day out. Now, just because they're not on the track doesn't make it any less dangerous. If you go down to Newmarket, you will see hundreds of horses on the gallops every morning. And if you've got somebody who is unsafe to ride, that can really cause an issue and potential danger to others. So for us, whilst we might not be able to stand down every jockey, if we can educate them as much as we possibly can, then hopefully in doing so, we're ensuring the safety of everybody.
Absolutely. And turning now to someone who has been on a field themselves and to someone who has been an athlete, Richard, if I could turn to you in your rugby career, just to start off with, what age did you start playing rugby, and at what age did you go pro, as it were?
So it was a bit late to it. Kind of started at like 12 or 13 playing at school, and then did university. So started playing semi-professionally at university, and then signed my first pro contract when I was 20.
Now, it's interesting you've mentioned school, because that is going perfectly into my next question. There are actually some schools who have made the decision to remove certain contact sports, such as rugby, from the curriculum due to the risk that it might pose to safety. Now, as you were playing throughout school, were you ever made aware of the risks that playing rugby might have, such as concussions?
Sure, major. When I was playing at school, it wasn't kind of a major talking point at the time. It was like it was an obvious kind of pitfall of playing rugby that you are going to bang your head at some point, or you potentially have the potential to do it. But it wasn't as in the limelight as it is now at schoolboy level. So no.
So as you were going through your career, where would you say that the guidance, in particular in concussions, was focused? Was it focused more on the management of concussions, or was it mainly on how to prevent it? Which one would you say it was more on?
More management. And then, to be fair, the focus on concussion in rugby has got massive. The longer time's gone on, the more the awareness has gone up on what the potential risks are, and more people coming out of the sport with like long-term injuries, like brain injuries, the more it's been focused on prevention and dealing with it. So the longer it went on, it was more focused on both sides of it, to be honest.
And this might be an obvious question, but do you think it's changed for the better, the way it is now dealing with concussions?
Yeah, massively. So I think the one of the major and probably most important things that's happened in rugby at the moment is they've got the implemented mouth guards. So with the mouth guards inside, there's a microchip that they plug into a computer after, and they can measure each force throughout the session. So it's from everything to do with running, being tackled, making tackles, and being tackled. Because that's one of the things, you don't think you can get concussed from being tackled, but the whiplash effect, lifting in lineouts, hitting scrums, all sorts is monitored, and they can kind of predict when you're at higher risk of when you're at risk of concussion. So they pull you out. So the more, that's the last couple of years, and more Premiership teams are taking that the technology on board, and then it's helping to prevent and monitor concussions. So, yeah.
That technology is remarkable. And do you know how widely implemented that technology is at the moment with the mouth guards?
So it was 2 years ago, Harlequins, when I was there, it was they were the test dummy team for them. So they trialed them, and it started off with big chunky mouth guards that no one really wanted to wear, and they've worn them down to like nice ones now. So they wore them just for games and training. And then last year at Bath, it was kind of compulsory unless you signed a form saying you didn't want to be part of the studies and the information. But I think it's across the Premiership now that all teams are wearing them for training and matches.
That is so incredibly interesting. And on that note, the timer has actually gone off. So unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Richard and Asia, thank you so much for coming in to speak with us. And it definitely has been interesting hearing from both points of view, from a legal perspective, as well as from an athlete on the topic of concussions. Now, before we finish up today, do you have any final remarks, either of you? You don't need to, I just always like to offer.
Asia?
Nothing from me, really. Sorry. I can't help you on that one.
No, just for me, with I feel sometimes rugby's viewed as rugby gets tarred with a bad brush. Like the concussion side of it is bad, but it's more, especially at school level, it's more prevalent in gymnastics and ballet because of the tumbles and turns and the force that you can put on yourself, that you can land on your head and bump your head when you're doing ballet and gymnastics in comparison to rugby, whereas the collisions, if they're coached correctly, can be monitored and looked after. You often, when people think about concussions, they go straight for rugby or straight for an obvious sport, but it's throughout. I'm kind of happy that more people are looking at it because it needs to be sorted, and I'm glad World Rugby and the people who are sorting out the rules are trying to cope with it. But I just feel like the more it's talked about and the more it's looked at and the more technology we can get in to help and prevent concussions and what happens to them, the better it is, and not just to tar rugby with a bad brush.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that, Richard. And thank you once again, Asia. And also thank you to all the listeners who have tuned in. Make sure you do join us next week as well for what will be the last episode in season 1. It will be a good one, as always, so make sure you don't miss it. Until then, see you soon.